Well, I think the best place to start is I don't know any of your background, Lauren. I know you are an out of the ordinary grower, if that's a fair way to put it.
I've been called worse.
Yeah, if you're an out of the ordinary grower, you are far from conventional. You're not anti-conventional, but you are far from just doing it the way it's always been done. So explain to me a little bit more your history with farming, how you got started, what that whole process was, and then kind of walk me through your life and some of the things you've seen, or some of the mindset shifts that you've made.
Probably the best place to start was where, I was born and raised here on this farm. And I would probably tell people I'm one of the fortunate guys in the world that my dad was the best business partner I ever could had. He set me up to learn. And, go back into the 70s when things were really hitting the fan back then, late 70s, early 80s. His innovation is what took him through the heart of the 80s. And, I started farming in 1986. 85, I think, is when I signed my first lease.
What was that innovation that kind of kept him afloat through those times?
Far as that, a lot of what my dad learned and brought to the operation here was things he saw in Germany back when he was there in the 1960s. So like the liquid manure handling systems and stuff like that, that was one of the things he always swore as soon as he could afford to do it, he was going to do it on his farm. Now go back to...
And back then, was it all dry spread?
Well, basically it was year-round spreading. The barn right below us was the barn cleaner, and that had to be cleaned every day. So you had to haul manure every day of the year, rain, sleet, hail, whatever. Snow. We got some pretty good pictures of back in the day, manure spreader stuck on the top of a 10-foot snowdrift. Stuff like that. And, that was his mindset. He was going to eliminate as much of that as possible. And, probably another key thought process that I picked up from my dad is waste not, want not. So through our feet, when we were still milking cows and stuff like that here, we bought very little inputs, or very few. And, we always, our pride and joy was the quality of feed that we produced. And
for your own cows.
For our own cattle. And then eventually, towards the end, before I had to get away from livestock completely, we as I was starting to get sick during that time frame, my brother went and built a dairy, and we were feeding that whole dairy from some of our produce and stuff like that. But at one point we were feeding, I'm guessing, 500 cows, and all the young stock were coming here and stuff like that. So we were producing basically all the corn, forage, and stuff like that. We never grew a soybean until 2000. I think it was 1999, the first year we produced soybeans, and that was as a test plot. So very heavy manure-based system is what we were built on. And through that time frame, as I started learning that I was going to have to get away from livestock, that's when I started grain farming.
What was the driver to move away from livestock?
I started picking up livestock disease and stuff like that. So when I was 14, I got hit broadside by a semi. And then one thing led to another. I started getting sick and stuff like that. So 10 years later...
May I ask how fast the semi was going? That sounds pretty intense.
Well, actually, it was right down here in town. That was 1982 or 83. I can't remember. I'd have to look up exactly when it was, but I was 14 years old. So I'm guessing it was 83. The 4440 was a big tractor at that time.
Uh-huh.
And that was the first year I really got to drive it. And we were doing field work. Last day up corn planting, actually, it was. And we had worked cattle that morning. And, before I headed out to the field, I polished the tractor every morning. Well, the one thing I forgot to do was clean that mirror. And right down here in town, I was turning into a field driveway.
Were you turning left?
Yeah.
Oh, man, yeah.
I was turning into the field driveway, and semi hit me broadside. It was under 45 mile. It's a 45 mile an hour zone, so he was probably slowed down to the point, but I spun the tractor around in the highway, and the first thing I did was fire back up the tractor because I was always warned, you don't cook the turbo. And everybody's like, they saw the tractor spin around, it died, and I couldn't see out the windows or anything. The windows were full of diesel fuel and stuff like that because the tractor hit me right, or the semi hit me here, then the front tires, and then the front fuel tank blew the top off, so it covered in diesel fuel. Couldn't see a thing, and
So yeah, definitely starting to back up is a good idea.
yeah, so I fired the tractor back up, hit my wipers on, and seen I was in the middle of the highway, and I pull it off to the side of the highway, and then I get out of the tractor and see what hit me. And I was never a small guy, but I went over and the semi was down in the pasture in the farm that I was heading to. And I went over there and carried the guy out over my shoulder and carried him up on the lawn. And by then the fire and the rescue was all starting to come. And, and everybody's like, well, how old are you? And that, and 14. And, everybody just couldn't believe how composure was. But, I've just, over the years, I've dealt with enough stuff. I don't get too excited about stuff. And, the more stuff you throw at me, that's when we tend to put our head down, and that's when we start figuring out how to make things work. Later that day, dealing with insurance and all that, and nobody could believe it to this day, but I was back out in the tractor that afternoon yet. Yeah. And everybody's like, well, why'd you do that? And I was like, what else was I supposed to do? And
So what were the consequences of that long term?
well, I took the steering wheel to the groin, and then one thing led to another, and working with livestock all the years, I started getting sicker, and health-wise started diminishing. And I think it was 1993 is I could be fine in the morning. By noon, I'd be laying on the floor with 105 temperature. And then we started doing diagnostics at the hospital, and I had basically every test they could throw at me, and they finally figured out that it was livestock disease were attacking my system. Scar tissue had built up over the years of working with livestock and stuff like that. And it got to the point every 8 hours I'd have to go in and get IVs. I even got to the point where I could hook up my own IVs and stuff like that. And the nurses up at the hospital, they just know when I'd come in, I'd just walk in, hook myself up, and they're like, go do whatever you want. And next thing I'd know, I'd go out in my pickup, I'd hop in, I'd go to the Barrels, kind of the drive-in restaurant up here. So I'd go up there and order supper and be sitting there getting my IV, and then I'd go back to the hospital, turn my bags back in, and come home. And the going joke is one of the nurses had something against her niece and kind of liked me, I guess, and introduced me to what's now my wife. So we have a little fun with that once in a while. But
There's a bright side of the story.
well, it's I this day and age, and the economy we're in right now, I see a lot of folks getting down on what's happening, and it's like, folks, this ain't nothing yet. And I was just old enough in the '80s to remember what happened, and but then I remember guys in the '80s saying, this ain't nothing yet. You should have seen the '30s. And that's always been. Go back in my history, you wanted to go all the way back. One of the best things I ever did is I used to pay attention to the old neighbors. Sunday afternoons, I would hop on the three-wheeler or four-wheeler, and I would go to the neighbors and just sit and have conversation with, the old landlords and stuff like that. And I would hear a lot about the history. Why is that relevant? Look back over my farming career now. A lot of what I figured out was figuring out how to bring that forward and tie it in with the technology that we have today. And that's where I think a lot of people struggle. They think we're doing something new. No, we're not. It's, as we've evolved through the years, I've always paid attention to what the old folks would do, what would my dad have did. And, try to figure out what was best back then and add the technology that we have at our fingertips today. And, that's another thing that hurts me these days when all these guys want to condemn technology. Chances are they're doing on better technology. Our cell phones were more technology than they had to launch the space shuttles back in the day and stuff like that. And
so when you say old ways, what are you referring to? Like, I'm thinking in my head, like, okay, the old ways of doing things. Well, definitely not you're probably not referring to let's turn over every inch of soil black all the time and just
Well,
throw seed out there and do like things like that. Not those old ways, but like what are the old ways you're referring to from these old guys you used to sit and listen to?
to do that, you had to understand why they did it and then change it with what we have available. They were, everybody talks about cover crops nowadays. Well, back then it was a green manure and the crop rotation and all that. They were doing that. One of the best influences, speaking engagements I ever did was out in Indiana. It was at Turkey Run Creek out there, or whatever the place was. But old Amishman came on there and he started telling the stories. He took current cover crops all the way back to the early 1600s lay cropping in England, and he brought that forward all the way through, and it just stuff like that always resonated me with, why did they do it back then? Why did we go away from it? It's even today's technology. As we try to go back, we got to remember why and how some of this stuff went away 50 years ago. Where we're sitting right now was the wheat belt at one time. Well, why did that go away? What's it going to take to bring it back here? Stuff like that. So when we started changing our cropping system and that was all things that was going through my mind. Fungus and that stuff chased the wheat and all that away from here. Well, am I going to want to bring fungicide in to help me grow wheat? Or do I want to change my row pattern and stuff like that to allow the air flow and stuff like that to learn and mitigate some of that stuff? Can I figure out the cover crop that helps mitigate some of that stuff? Or a lot of what we've done instead of terminating cover crops is, can I suppress a cover crop to allow it to help the cash crop yet not hurt it? Stuff like that. So that led to the roller crimping and stuff like that we've been involved in.
So zoom out a little bit, we're talking about wheat and cover crops, things like that, as we're sitting in, the middle of Northeast Iowa, which is a place that I would not say is known for either cover cropping.
We're in the heart
wheat.
of the Corn Belt.
Yeah, we're in the heart of the Corn Belt, and we're in a particular area of the country where things like cover cropping and even growing something like wheat isn't even tolerated. It's frowned upon. I'm sure you've had neighbors tell you you're crazy and that's never going to work and things like that. So what was the thought process as you continue to learn to be I don't care what they think? And I just hear all these objections all the time online, and I'm well, I'm not going to make a definitive statement of this is right, this is wrong, but it's we have to find that how did you figure out, how did you come to that conclusion of this is something that I think I can try, despite being told this might be a little crazy?
I never paid attention, and the hidden secret about me is when I started pushing the envelope, there was a lot of people that weren't smart enough that knew that I knew what they were saying about me. So I would probably push the envelope a little harder just to see how fast a rumor would come back to me. And that's when you start knowing who you can trust and stuff like that. Who's your true allies and stuff like that. And if somebody's going to talk about me, I don't even pay attention anymore. I just, the nickname we acquired many years ago was the Honey Badger. And if you've ever watched that on YouTube, I mean that's the mindset we acquired. And I never actually went to a conference until 2016, I think it was. And at that time already, we were nominated for the No-Till Innovator Award. And got the nomination, and I didn't know how that all worked. So I was well, I suppose I should go to the conference once. Well, then companies that I was working with started figuring out that I would show up at a conference. So I've been quite a few conferences since then. But I'm proud of what I see happening right now. Now there's a younger generation starting to take what we've done and do better than we ever thought we could do. And, just stepping aside and watching that ideal, somebody take your ideal and do better is always kind of fun.
What was your main motive? First of all, what was your main motive, and when did you start making changes? What was the motive to start trying some of these things, to be getting a little more creative, or, so when did all that happen? / what was the reasoning for it?
Probably goes back to some of the mindset. I mean, if I'm going to do what my neighbors are doing, I'm going to probably get what my neighbors are doing. So if I can figure out how to do something different, I'm going to get better. And if I'm smart enough to engineer and build something that nobody else can do around here, that opens me up to do things, and you start hearing landlords, if they start appreciating what you do, they'll start seeking out, the conservation was a big aspect. My dad go back to my dad, he was one of the first guys that had a chisel plow in this area. And, early 80s, he tried no-tilling and stuff like that, but it wasn't until we started learning to manage the manure and stuff like that, and then opening up the cropping system. Another advantage to what we started doing was it spread out our workload and stuff like that. I've through some of our other things, I've had enough employees that I don't ever want to have an employee myself. No offense to employees, but I've learned over the years, what me and my wife can do. Right now we're in transition. We're trying to help the kids take over more of what I'm doing as I step away more, but it's just knowing what you want and what you don't want. And, probably the thing driving me yet today is the grandkids are starting to take a little interest. Over the years, we've ebbed and flowed and trying to figure out what's relevant for where we're at right now. And, probably the other thing that drove us over the years is profitability. And, you asked earlier, like the relay cropping, and that is profitable. Well, I wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't making me money. And, but even there, we kind of backed into the relay cropping and that stuff as we started, as the livestock started going away. I started hearing about diversity and what it could do for us, because, at one point I think the planters and combine went over about 2,500 acres. Heavy corn rotation, probably 400 or 500 acres of alfalfa. And, I knew what the crop could do after a crop of alfalfa, but as the livestock went away, I struggled to figure out how to replace that until we started, 2006 is when I started dabbling with interseeding in corn. At that time, I started hearing guys interseeding at V8. So knee-high, almost waist-high corn, they were dropping their cover crop in there, and we started dabbling with that. But, as I always joke with folks, the tech support was pretty limited, so I started reading and stuff like that, and, I kind of stumbled upon the earlier we would interseed, the better our success rate would be. And then University of Tennessee actually had some of the best data that was published, and that was books from 1870 to 1890. And the neat part is when you really started diving into some of that stuff, what worked back then still works today. So, some of them core principles, I've always kept them at the back of my mind. Cover crop mix, we started with clover. And everybody's like, oh, why'd you start with clover? Well, when we were making a lot of hay, I started noticing we could seed straight alfalfa, and within 3 to 4 years, we had heavy clover mix naturally. Clover just thrives in this area. So that, in corn, we started seeding clover and stuff like that. We got all the way down to V3, V4 is when optimum time in our area was.
Back then, what were you using for interseeding? Like what equipment were you using?
Oh, shoot, you name it, we've tried it. And, the willingness to adapt and build has been one of my strong suits. So we never really kill a project. We just keep evolving it. And pretty much built everything I ever had. And
What did the contraption look like?
well, early on, I would start with a broadcast. Just I took a broadcast seeder that you pull behind a UTV. I made a hook on it, and I put it over my shoulder, and I'd walk down the corn rows. And then went and bought a garden seeder, and I would push that down the corn rows, just doing plot scale. And then when we'd start seeing success, that's when you knew you were onto something, and we'd field scale things usually pretty quick. And once upon a time, I think it was 2008, I had we were starting to look at strip till and stuff like that. I knew I didn't want a shank machine at that time, so I built a strip till bar based on a Ross and Zone till system, so the 3 Coulter system, but we went and pitched them and angled them and stuff like that. And to make that work, Even where we weren't putting strips, I built a secondary bar to go behind that. That was all coulters. So we could strip till or we could vertical till back then already. And then when that happened to be set up like a cultivator, because our strips would be set up, and then we needed to fill the gaps. So that bar was set up to go in between the rows. Well, when we started figuring out the inner seating, actually needed soil incorporation and stuff like that to really make it work. I took a seed box off of another strip till project and set that on the toolbar and plumbed it up. The biggest thing I did is the same way I would always set my corn planter, I'd set each row different. So instead of making one pass and trying to figure out what worked, I'd have 12 in one pass. And, I could look at each row and gauge each row, so that sped up our learning process by the factor of 12. And, like my corn planter, when we were still manually setting row cleaners and stuff like that, you'd pick out the one you want, well, set every row to that one. Instead of wasting time setting the planter 10 or 12 times, within a pass, I could usually have it dialed in. And, that just sped up our learning process. We learned very quick. Right after that, I bought a Henniker drill because I knew I wanted the seed engagement and stuff like that. Took it in the shop, tore that down and rebuilt it the way I wanted the drill built. And, the neat part is we could tear the whole planter apart with a 1/2-inch wrench, 9/16, and a 15/16. Simple. And, it actually worked. In my mind, it worked better than OEM. I had run Deere drills before that. This was just simple, but I also started seeing the inherent issues with that. So always willing to improve and never getting married to anything equipment-wise has just been, I'm always looking for how to make something better. And, that over the years, that started, I worked with a lot of equipment companies, auto steer and stuff like that. The first wiring harnesses in our tractors were hand part numbered from Deere. So we've been working with some of that technology very early on. It's the other thing I learned through some of that is the minute you take a deep breath or a hiccup, you're so far behind you can't even try to catch up, or you got to spend a lot of time and effort to catch up. And that's why we keep our feet to the fire here pretty hard.
Was there a moment when you were younger? You said you started farming in 86.
85 is probably when I rented my first farm. And the neat part to that, it was the first organic farm I rented 30 years later.
Oh, nice. So it's stayed. I mean, that's awesome that you get to farm it again.
Yeah.
Was there a moment or a particular memory that you have? It was like, hey, I want to continue to do things differently, improve. Was there like this is like we're onto something, or we need to change, or like this guy's got it figured out and we don't? Like, do you have a memory of like, hey, I want to be an innovator. I want to keep trying new things.
I hate to say it, but I'd say no. I struggle with any self-proclaimed innovators because, it's even like me writing things down. We went through business classes and all that with some of our other entities and stuff like that. And, they always want you to write down a business plan. Well, I'm like, the minute I take the time to write something down, it's antiquated. If you write it on paper, it's going to be harder to change. But if you have a fluid mindset and management style, you're always looking to adapt and change. And I'll let somebody else call me the innovator. That's I would give my dad the credit for being the innovator. He was my mentor. He was my learning. He's the one that opened the doors for me, and I just carry on what he's doing. And now that's coming full circle. I'm enjoying helping other people experience that excitement and stuff like that. And it's no hidden secret that I'm trying to step away from the farm more and more, and just watching and seeing them young people's minds that can do it better than I ever would have fathomed is the driving force now.
Yeah. So with that, you say the driving force, for most of your career, was it survival? Was it profitability? Survival. Was it like sustainability? What's been your, hey, I know I have to do this to keep going.
Well, my competitive edge is the survival instinct, I think. And, as I said, product of the 80s, survival mode was ingrained in my heart. We've never tried to achieve the best, but focus on quality, do the best job we can, and do it with as little as possible. And I've had some pretty nice equipment over the years, but the best thing I ever figured out is supporting, getting a Christmas card from Deere was not the ultimate goal. I did get a few of them when I was really pushing hard, but you can be replaced on that Christmas card list. And I started focusing on the people that really meant something to me, and that was I would have to say probably the most pivotal point in my career was my oldest daughter. I was pushing pretty hard during that time frame. I mean, that was when we were at that 2,500 acre peak, and we were feeding 400 or 500 head of cattle here, providing all the feed for the dairy and all that stuff. Plus, I was custom baling. I think we ran, it got to the point at one time I would, every time a tractor would hit 750 to 800 hours, Deere would bring me a different tractor. And that was getting down to 7 or 8 months. So I was putting 750 to 800 hours on a tractor every 7 or 8 months. And I know for some of the California folks and that ain't much, but for Northeast Iowa, that's sitting in the seat a lot. It got to the point where 2 o'clock in the morning, whoever picked me up would have to take me back because I probably couldn't remember where the baler was at. And, I came home, I'd get home by 2 o'clock in the morning usually, and 4 o'clock I would get up and start doing chores. And then about 7, 8 o'clock, somebody would take me back to wherever the baler was, and away we'd go. And, 500 bales a day, 100 miles on the road a day in the tractor.
Did you ever fall asleep baling?
No, I just, I would say in my teenage years that might have been a possibility, but I just, I was on a mission. And, go back to the John Deere conversations, Bill Nightingale was one of the district reps, and he's like, one of those aha moments. He's like, this boy owes us $2 million over his lifetime. Well, nowadays that's not much.
Yeah.
But you go back to, that would have been late 90s when he made that comment. $2 million was a lot.
That was a lot, yeah.
And I sat there and I'm like, oh my God, I'm working for Deere. And, I said, and I think it was 2004. If I didn't have enough to do in the summer, I would go sit in a semi all winter for the neighbor. So I was at one point I was putting 80 hours a week on in the wintertime, just keeping busy in the semi, plus keeping the farmer going and stuff like that. And then it finally hit me through that time frame. I was like, I just need to start doing my own work at home. And I could make more up in marketing and stuff like that than I could sitting in a semi. So that following year we overhauled what became the shop into a shop. We took a 1978 machine shed and built that into a shop that left this spring. And
Left.
yeah, just inconveniently part of the chat group. And, and that's goes back, and everybody during that time frame, they're like, oh my God, we're so sorry you lost your shop. And I'm like, nobody got hurt. It's not that big a deal. The hardest thing to replace that was in that shop, once we realized nobody was hurt, was on the north wall. There was a shelf with prototypes of everything I ever built. That one hurts a little bit, but hopefully I don't go senile for a while, and I got a pretty good memory. I can remember what I all built, and and that it's even, I think it's 7 or 8 years ago I went to work for Dawn Equipment at one point there, help on their engineering team, and I just, part of the deal that time was I never wanted to deal with patents and stuff like that. Now I fast forward to where we're at now, I find out, basically everything I ever did with Dawn, if I was actually involved in the projects, they should have put my name on the project. But as I tell people nowadays, Deere owns them patents to my knowledge. So yeah, I'm not going to argue that one. It's just like, I always looked at stuff, I didn't care if anybody knew what we were doing. I figured the people that needed to know knew I was involved in the background. And, we've got a lot of fame and fortune for stuff we've done over the years. None of it meant anything long long as my kids still knew who I was and stuff like that, and my dad respects what I've been able to do over the years, and and dad was never one of those type of people to give a guy compliments until through the ebbs and flows. 2009, I kind of figured my farming career would end with me, and then fast forward to 2015, we were hosting events here in the barn and stuff like that, starting to people were paying attention, and we hosted what I called my expert farmer panel at that time. We had 4 guys, average age was 80. And, my dad was on the farmer panel that time, and it was a couple of the old guys left in the neighborhood that I respected. And, it was like watching kids, just explaining how, quackgrass was the original cover crop. I found out that night, but then, Jill Clapperton asked my dad that time, what he thought of what I was doing on the farm. He's like, listen here, I got the best tenant I could ever ask for. And I'm like, he said that?
Except the fact he called you a tenant.
Well, but that's the relationship. Everything with my dad has always been cut and dried. And that's not a negative. That's been a strong suit. So everything I've ever done had to cash flow. That goes back to even the interseeding, and that when we started figuring out, I mentioned earlier, 2006 is when I started interseeding. It took a lot of time and effort to learn, because I didn't have Google back then. I wasn't able to just say, hey, I'm thinking about this. Who do I call? What do I do? It took us all the way to 2012 to actually get comfortable that we knew what we were doing on that. But then by 2014, we were doing it at every acre. And then 2013, as we're going through that learning process, I met a guy in Wisconsin, John Coots, online, and I started paying attention to what he was doing with the relay cropping and stuff like that. So I reached out to him, and since then we became strong friends and stuff. I respect everything he's ever helped me learn and understand about the system. He had things figured out then that just blew my mind, but I see a lot of guys go through the same learning curve we went through. People won't believe you until they experience pain. You can tell them every little problem we've ever had. You can try to help them avoid it. But a lot of times in this mindset, they will not avoid a disaster.
Well, I mean, that's also just human condition. I've experienced that a lot in business, where I'll make a mistake and I'll lose money on something, and I'll remember back, yeah, someone definitely told me not to do that, and I didn't listen because I thought I knew better and I thought I knew what was best. And then I felt the pain, and I'm like, well, now I understand why that person told me that, because they went through the exact same thing. Yeah. And if I had just listened to them the first time, and I think that's just, a learning process. But everyone has that choice of you can choose to stop and say, I'm going to learn from this, the pain that's happening, or I'm going to choose just to brute force my way through and hope the pain doesn't happen again. There's two mindsets you can take there.
Well, that's been one of the keys over the years, is you've got to learn to set up a trial to where it hurts, but it won't kill you. Because if it don't hurt, you're destined to do it again. And that goes back to over the years, recognizing success and failure is hard for a lot of people to do, because they put pride into it, or their ego gets into it, and you just got to throw that stuff out the window. And, if you're trying to make sound decisions, you've got to recognize the success and failure. And, I told you earlier, it might scare you where I learned that, but that came from the hair salon industry. And, one of the things a lot of people don't understand is we hear a lot about first-generational farmers and stuff like that. Well, I respect them, but I also respect the strong family farm, because that's a totally different skill set. The first-generational farmer has nobody telling them what to do or what's wrong. So you head into it blind, and you learn, and you succeed and fail. Well, on the flip side, the strong generational family farm has the knowledge in that, but you've got to get over that young buck mindset. So and that's where I think my dad was brilliant. He was the type of mindset that would always give us a chance. As long as you took advantage of it, he would open the next door. You had to keep walking through the doors, and that's kind of what I've tried to acquire the mindset. I love working with younger minds now. You know, go back to 2009, that's one of the hardest days in my life is when you wake up one day and all of a sudden the next generation might not be there. You know, in 2009, when my son got diagnosed with a brain tumor, I thought I was building that strong generational farm mindset. You know, had dad, had myself, I had the next generation coming. Poof, that could be gone. You know, we're one of the fortunate ones these days. I'll tell anybody, you know, we're just lucky we have problems yet. It hasn't been easy. But through that whole decision-making process, we made the mindset that that's not going to control us. You know, I've seen too many families get tore apart by cancer and stuff like that. We made the conscious decision, we're not going to do that. Well, through that whole process, a lot of people started thinking, oh, geez, they're rich. You know, look at the way they keep going through, you know, and it's just like, sorry. I get I get cold on some of that stuff, and I'm making the best decision I can for our family at that time, and our success rate's been pretty high, and that's bring it fast forward to where we're at today in the current ag economy. I'm trying to figure out what am I missing, because I've implemented everything I've said I was going to do, and right now I'm not feeling the pain I see a lot of guys feeling that pain. So I'm trying to figure out what I'm missing right now. Or do I just take a little success once and say, hey, what we've been working at has actually worked. But my mindset doesn't get comfortable in that way.
And that's a hard conversation to enter into, because there is that like, hey, I feel for everyone who's going through a hard time right now in this farm economy. But also, like, we're not feeling those pressures nearly as bad as everyone else. And so is that because we've been making the right decision, the crazy decisions for all this long, and now we're seeing the fruit of it? Like, it's a hard, especially if you don't want to, be on the pedestal and be like, well, I figured it out, guys. Like, it's hard to accept that, like, hey, we have made good decisions, and because of our little failures for many, 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 many years, we figured out, hey, on the bad years, it might just work out. Because, like, that's the thing. It's like on a year like this is a year where, like, guys are getting just beat up left and right.
Well, I know. But that goes back to not getting locked in the mindset. You know, I did things this year, 5 years ago, I said I probably wouldn't be doing anymore. You know, I'm 100% corn this year. Was it pure blind dumb luck? I don't know. But it was the right decision to make at that time. You know, a year ago, I started making decisions because I knew I was going to have both knees replaced. You know, last year was kind of the anomaly year. We went into spring some of the best setup I ever had on the relay crop and all that. Well, as the year unfolded, with all the rain we had and that, I pulled the plug on the relay last year. Turned out it was the most profitable decision I could make. I got chastised publicly for making them decisions. Go ahead and knock yourself out. If you want to poke holes in I don't care. I don't get hung up on what other people think. And, it was a rough couple of weeks when people were publicly tearing you down, but I just kept doing what we're doing.
People would say, like, oh, you failed, like it didn't work out for you. Like, what was the discourse
around
that?
There was certain people, and they're not even farmers is what really bites. That's saying, oh, you're telling all these guys you should be doing this, but you went and did that. It's like, well, the reason I did that is here. But hey, if you're not going to listen to that, anybody who knows me is I'm pretty open in public what we're doing. I don't hide anything. And early on when I started sharing, somebody said, well, why do you share it so much? I was like, they're going to figure it out anyway.
Yeah, transparency is the best way to dispel any sort of gossip. It's like, well, you can't come at me if I will share, if I lay out every fact for you, if I lay out, there's some guys who are like, I'll lay out my financial statements for you to show that I'm doing just fine. But, but that's the other thing is like people are going to choose to believe what they want to believe regardless of that,
Well,
there's only so much you can do,
That's hitting on one of my biggest gripes right now is we've got some pretty solid data behind what we've done. But now everybody's second guessing us, and they'll believe the guys throwing out the outlandish claims and stuff like that. And it's like,
And just because you took a year off and it was wildly profitable doesn't mean you've quit entirely. It means
No.
like, hey, I have knees that need to be replaced. It rained a lot. Like I think that gets into the reasonable farmer and the idealistic farmer, because I've met lots of guys like that. I met someone in California. They run a ranch. They always finish with barley. They finish with all the leftover barley from all the distilleries because it's cheap. It's a high quality feed. They can say it's not entirely grain fed. It's great for the marketing. But he's telling me, he's like, there are times where I cannot get my hands on truckloads of barley. You know what that means? I'm gonna feed my cows corn. And if I was an idealist and I only farmed by that, we would be bankrupt right now.
Well, I would say that we're hitting on something that really needs to be touched on this day and age. I've never subscribed to anything. If anybody asks me how I farm Loran. I've never sat down and wrote out my doctrine. This is how you got to farm. This is how you got to do it. And part of that goes back to one of my mentors is David Brandt. When I first met him, he would always say it only works in West Carroll, Ohio. Well, when I started getting asked to go speak, I was like, folks, just be warned. This works in the 52175. Use it at your discretion. And, I still try to maintain that. Anything I tell anybody is going to be what worked on our farm. Bear in mind, it's probably going to change, and it's going to keep changing. Another thing I would say just in the last couple of years, the realization I've had is getting a son-in-law is a pretty good thing. It's made me stop and think about everything I say. Because my son-in-law's family is a strong conventional farm family. Probably some of the best operators in the area. I'd put them up against anybody. Working together now the last 2-3 years through transition, helping each other learn and understand without sitting there saying, you got to do this, you got to do that. Hey, I've made some mistakes on my own, but I was willing to sacrifice, probably the best way I would put it, I was willing to safety up to help them learn. Now, in the end, it cost me dearly because, that was last year with all the rain. We've evolved to a system. My soil is addicted to cover crops. I might as well say it that way. It takes a living root out there to keep sucking up all the extra moisture we can hold. Well, last year, to help them learn and understand our system, we terminated everything earlier than I have probably in 10 years. That proved to be one of the worst decisions I could make, but I'll still stick behind it because, hey, we were in a D4 drought going into spring. Everything said terminate. So we terminated.
And you did it, and you kind of regretted it, but you're like, hey, now we have this, I love the phrasing tuition payment. We have this tuition payment that might be, hey, yeah, we lost some money that we didn't have to, but now this younger generation has made that tuition payment for the next time they go around. They say, hey, I remember when we did this in 2024. I think we should hold on a little longer. I think that's, but that, you only learn those things by, like, you can say that, but it's not going to get through as a young guy. It's not going to get through our head unless you kind of feel the pain like you were talking about.
Well, fast forward to this year, with the way the cover crops went last year, we had a lot of covers did not germinate till spring. And sprayer operator is like, hey, you need me to go spray them fields? I was like, there's nothing out there. We're just going to be wasting money. And we pulled, no burn down, no nothing this year. So we were kind of back to business as usual in my world. And, I joke with everybody, the beauty of the way our farm has evolved. Son-in-law's crew comes in and plants 1,000 acres roughly in 10 hours. And, it is just, and the reason I say that is part of the reason I have them do my farming right now is it opens the door for me to watch technology. I'm not giving up on technology. I'm a firm believer in the swarm technology and stuff like that. And, as I watch their 4 planters running my field, I'm constantly watching and evaluating what's the difference. 4 planters basically the same when they start the season, but the operators make a difference. Last year I could show you the difference between each operator, and that's not a bad statement. But subtle little things make a difference, and you don't really know it until after they happen.
Well, also you're going to be able to see the effects of the planting window much more clearly because
Oh.
you're like, hey, I have one test case. I know that these 1,000 acres are all planted the exact same day.
Yeah.
Well, if we know that we can start dialing in our 1 or 2 planting days versus our 2 weeks that it used to be, like think about the efficiency gains there that most people can't realize because they don't have the fleet to understand that. You know,
And then-
we're just this is a whole new space we're entering into of like, guys, we can plant whole fields and we can plant whole farms in 2 days. You know, like we are like high speed planters are here. You can plant twice as fast as you used to like 6 years ago, basically. Like, you know, stuff like that. Like we're still learning all the cool intricacies and tricks that can be done with that we know now. I mean, yeah.
Well,
that's
and
cool.
somebody in Kansas or Colorado or something like that's not going to realize the effect the way we will here. You know, you're living in Waterloo, right? You're usually 2 to 3 weeks ahead of where I'm at right here. And, you know, we're on the edge of the glacial till line. I tell folks, when I first started paying attention to what's going on in the world, I never realized how much impact that had on our farming. But, you know, we have the same number of growing degree days as they do north of Minneapolis. You know, some of the charts that I used to share with people, it goes right up to basically Fargo. And it's mind-blowing. You know, some of the early slides I shared is we got 130 days of frost-free days. A friend of mine down in southeast Iowa has 165. You know, that's dramatic when it comes to making some of this stuff work and, you know, learning and understanding and not thinking we can outsmart Mother Nature. You know, I see a lot of folks think that we can trick her. You know, one of the favorite slides my wife used to like that I put together, I think it was 2015 or 16. It's a picture of Mother Nature. And the simple caption is, Mother Nature's illiterate. She can't read your plans. You know, and you listen to hear a lot of these people. And anytime I've tried to outsmart her, she humbles me hard. And, you know, do I know what I'm doing today? No, but the ability to adjust to whatever Mother Nature's throwing at you and recognizing what she's throwing at you soon enough. You know, to this day, people ask me, what's my rotation? I don't have one. You know, I'm trying to figure out right now what I'm doing next year yet. You know, about a year ago right now is when I sat down and I started making adjustments for the following year. You know, I don't know if it was brilliance or I don't know if I just got lucky. But, you know, as soon as I committed to going all corn this year, I locked in corn sales. Probably a pretty good decision right now for what I'm seeing, unless the market is totally off, like I'm guessing a lot of people are right. But I've slept awful good a lot of nights. And, you know, a lot of people see what we do as...
So you're the reason the WASD reports are so high on all this stuff this year. It's okay. One of the guys I used to work with, he's, you know, I was driving by his farm, he's like, wow, all your alfalfa fields are cornfields this year. That's why everyone's saying this. Yeah.
Well, but go back to not being committed to any one doctrine or religion, whatever you want to call it to. I use fungicide this year, and I'll probably get chastised for making that comment because, hey, I'm a pretty firm believer anytime we've ever used fungicide in the past, it's cost me money. But I was starting to watch this summer unfold, and son-in-law's crew, you know, they'll firmly believe 30, 35 bushel an acre difference every year. And I was like, well, I guess I'm dumb enough. I got to see is there that much difference on my farm? So we committed acres, but every field was going to have a buffer. And then any field that's going to ear corn this fall wasn't going to get sprayed because the guy that's getting ear corn's like, we never do that. Okay. Well, about a day or two before the helicopter showed up, we had a little wind event and shredded a lot of leaves. And I'll go back to the last time I used fungicide. I think that was 2009 come to think of it, because we had, I was going to do kind of the same trial I did this year on fungicide, but we got hail on almost every acre, and I just, instead of applying the full rate of fungicide, I applied a light rate of fungicide on every acre of bean that year. We went from 90% hail loss to we had 50, 60 bushel beans. just by that subtle little management change. I know right across the fence the guy was getting 8 to 10 bushel beans. But timing that and paying attention and being ready to go paid dearly that time. Fast forward to this year, as I seen this year unfold, I convinced myself at one point, I was like, well, if fungicide's ever going to pay, this is going to be the year. So, like I said, we committed about half our acres up front. And then I would say I haven't even looked at the bill yet to see where we're actually at, but we kept the 100-foot buffer on every field except for 1 or 2 that we added late, and there's a reason I'm in no hurry to combine. I guess I'll put it that way. And what are we, middle of September here? So, and I was down to Ames yesterday and there's an awful lot of corn out down that way, and the yield reports are not good.
Yeah, there's some people down in where was I? Oh, I was down near Strawberry Point, and there was already a guy who had a couple hundred acres out like 2 weeks ago, and I'm like, my goodness, corn already? Like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Let's dig into that. Like, there's a certain crowd on the internet that loves to tout regenerative agriculture as the savior of the American farm, and not knowing our systems well, knowing how complicated and complex our agriculture industry is, know very well it is not a blanket statement. And I also have lots of friends who are phenomenal conventional growers that I think run very solid businesses. And I don't want to come in and think I know everything. But there's very clearly this strong discourse online, and you've been around a while, between you must go all regenerative, you must do this, and you're crazy, we're going to turn everything black, we're going to do it the way we want because this is how it works. Like, how have you navigated those conversations in your career? Because I'm sure they have come up a few times, given where you live in the country. It's very hard to handle well, and I've not seen it. Nick Voss is probably one of the only. Have you met Nick Voss?
Yep.
Yeah, he's probably one of the only people I know who's pretty into regenerative stuff, but also like will say like, hey, I can't bankrupt my guys telling like them you should go do all these things.
Well, I mean, part of that is the minute you start subscribing to a certain thing, you're locked into the mindset. And early on, they were throwing out what we were doing as regenerative, but the minute things start getting put on paper is when I started getting scared of some of that. The carbon credits and all that, and it's. I would have to lie to get any carbon credits, and something's wrong with that. I mean, we've got data that genuinely proves that we're actually building soil. What do you call that? I don't know. I don't really care. I mean, just
the IRS
just pay
has
me.
been told they need to figure it out. So
Well, but that's the scary part is anytime we get government intervention, the pendulum is going to swing. And, I got kicked out of a meeting in Minnesota once upon a time when they used to end all their meetings with the farm lobbying session. And they're like, Loran, what do you think? I just went like this. They're like, what's that mean? I was like, 0. 0 is the only fair number. From what I've seen over the years, everybody wants to set the bar just over their head. So they are eligible for a payment, but the guy above them isn't. They think it's a competitive advantage. Just last night. Just last night, it was tagged on a post there. Pepsi and McDonald's now have a regenerative program. What does that actually mean? How much of that is actually going to get back to the farmer? Or even further, how much of it actually is going to get implemented on the land? I've alluded to the data we have before. Nobody has compensated me a bit for any of that. Doesn't matter. I don't care. It's equaled profit for me. We can show, many years ago, I think it was 2014, we were asked to be part of a tile line monitoring program. That's kind of when we started figuring out something different was happening on our farm than the neighbors' farms. And I wasn't even pushing the envelope hard at that point. We were doing different things. Like I said, some of the stuff we were doing probably was out there. but we were doing it to make money. Go back to the interseeding. We documented over the years that we were getting $15 an acre more, or 15 bushel for $15 a seed. I'll take that bet. And I got told I was a liar at times because of that. Go ahead. I don't care. What's the old revenge is best served cold? When we really started talking about the relay cropping and that, I was sharing hard numbers, what we were doing. They weren't extravagant, but they were numbers I could back up. I got told I was a liar. Knock yourself out. I can't help that you can't get the premium that I can get. But if I'm going to run a piece of equipment, I'm going to learn how to set it, fine-tune it. We're going to be eligible to get them premiums to get that. At that time, we were getting $3 overboard on food-grade soybeans. Do I have to show you the checkbook? I don't care. The funny part is, fast forward to, I believe it was a year ago, the young gentleman came to a meeting. He's like, hey, I got to thank you. I was like, for what? He's like, I called you a liar several years ago. Yet I've always listened to what you always said, and you based stuff on fact, and you kept things real. We started doing that stuff on our farm, and today I can back that number up. That's about as good a thank you as you can get. And that's what I allude to when I say, we're to that point where it's fun seeing that next generation take what we've done and do it better. Do I still have a few tricks up my sleeve? There's a few things I want to do yet. There's some things I want to try before I hang it up. That's why I'm still, everybody's trying to guess what we're doing on the farm here right now. It's like, well, we're adapting and overcoming. I'm trying to slow down and help the next generation figure out. But if these knees work, or if I get it, I tell everybody, I just need a younger mind around here full time. And, there for a while, we had some pretty good interns and stuff like that. And I'm too busy to slow down for some of that right now. I would like to get back into that mindset and help a few younger guys be the best they can be, I guess, is probably the best way I can put that. And, I think if we're successful within the next 5 to 10 years here, there's going to be a major change in the cropping systems. But that's going to have to be backed up by, the government's going to have to change what they're doing or something.
Yeah, when we talk about that, I mean, we're kind of at this point in U.S. agriculture where the public discourse on what is happening on farms and the way subsidy systems work and the way trade deals work is starting to come under a lot more scrutiny. There's always been whispers, but seemingly the past 2 years, the opposition to subsidies. I mean, I had a family member say this the other day. It's like, oh, farmers just want their subsidies. That's all they want. And you and I are both on Twitter. We know how wild Twitter is right now. It's everyone dragging Trump through the mud after they voted for him, saying, why aren't you making these trade deals? You hate farmers, all these things. And it's just like almost ripping our hair out. Like, is there any way to please this industry? I'm starting to realize, no, there isn't. But no. Why do you think we are kind of at this point? Like, what do you think has led us to this point where all we're doing is growing more and more corn and soybeans, and we are demanding new markets for it? And we are basically kind of at this point where everyone's saying, we need better trade deals. We need better trade deals. Well, not realizing we have massive oversupplies of both these crops that we're having to create artificial avenues for them to go in, and no consideration that we should try to change the way things are. And not to mention the government also saying they want healthier food, but not backing that up with actually where federally subsidized crop dollars go.
Goes back to that little zero. Anytime the government gets influenced, it goes back to several things we've tried over the years. Go back to, I'm old enough to remember the PIC days and stuff like that. When, the government started paying us to seed set aside and stuff like that. Me as a young farmer during that time frame, the government became my biggest competition. How fair was that? Even today yet, Go right down the road there. There's $365 an acre CRP land. There could have been another young farmer. There's 1,000 acres within a couple miles of here. Could have been another young farmer, but we retired the land, retired the farmer. And anytime we start asking for more subsidies, and hey, I'll tell anybody, I grew up in a time frame where if you didn't farm the government, you weren't going to survive. So that's always stuck in my mind. I'm not going to turn down any subsidies right now yet today. I'm not that well off, but it's just the competitive nature we are in this area. There's an awful lot of high dollar rent ground around here. And that goes back to, everybody's like, well, so-and-so does it here. So-and-so does it there. It's like, look at their land cost. You start talking $400 an acre rent, you better figure out how to make it work.
And we're kind of at this point where we've built this not even hodgepodge system, just this, we've built a house of sticks. Not even cards. Cards are more sturdy than the sticks we've built this system with, where it's kind of like we just keep placing little twigs on top of each other. And we're like, this is a sturdy building. But when we realize, oh, shoot, China's not going to buy our corn or our soybeans anymore, where are we going to go, where we can go with this? It starts to shake a little. And we all say, government, add another stick on top to prop it up, make sure it keeps going. But we're at this point where it's like land is too high to farm anything else but corn and soybeans in Iowa. I know because I'm pretty confident that if I tried to start farming anything but corn and beans in Iowa, every bank would say, get out of here. You're not going to do this. And the government would say, yeah, you're on your own. We're not going to back any of this. So, how do we, we're at this spot where it's like, hey, something is probably going to break at some point. And do we really want to acknowledge that or when it happens, or do we want to say, hey, what are some small shifts that could happen now? Because I'm always thinking through that. It's like, guys, like we have massive city populations demanding healthy food, right? That is like one of the number one things in the news right now. Our food is killing us. Our food is killing us. And I wouldn't say it's completely at the detriment of the farmers. I would say, hey, we have a lot of multiple players in here. We're looking at, I have people send me articles all the time. What do you think of this? What do you think of this? I'm like, what else are they supposed to do? What is the easiest on-ramp for these guys to do anything but what they're doing now? Because there isn't an easy on-ramp.
Go back to your twig analogy. Look at a bird nest. You just got to start figuring out how to pack the mortar in there to help fill them little voids. And that'd be my advice to any young guy right now, or young farmer. I better say that because there's an awful lot of young ladies that are doing a pretty good job right now.
Oh, yeah, I think they'll kick a lot of old guys' butts.
And, well, it's just, go back to the 80s. That's the mortgage lifters, stuff like that. We've got to get that mindset. We've been too easy lately, that one-trick pony. And I don't like that mindset that we can't, a young farmer can't compete. Goes back to that younger, fresh, ideal mindset. Things are constantly changing. The willingness to accept technology. But the caveat is you can't spend yourself drunk. Too many people, they want to get into it, but then they spend themselves poor. And, go back to what I would say is one of my strong suits. I've built into everything we've done. We never try to buy into anything. Blue sky is expensive. If you try to buy something that somebody else is doing, you got overhead. And it goes back to the hair salon. And one of the reasons I brought that up earlier is, that's where I acquired that mindset to recognize success and failures. It goes back to the first generational farmer. Me getting into the hair salon industry was a mindset shift. I've always been brought up, business is business. Well, you don't really understand what that means until you step out of your current business into something you have no reason to be into.
Yeah. Explain the hair salon analogy just a little more in detail.
Well, when I got married, my wife was introduced to me that she was going to go to cosmetology school, and then my first reaction was, does she want to or does she need to? Well, fortunately, she wanted to. And she had the mindset that she was always going to be better than anybody else in the industry. And then once she worked for a couple salons uptown and that, and we decided one day that we were going to open a hair salon. So we just went and rented a building and started building. We didn't know what the heck we were doing. kind of like that first generational farmer. But what I learned through that whole process was the hardware store and the family hardware store in town was no different than a generational farmer. Now you take somebody that's never done it and stick them into that system, that's when you get them fresh ideas. You know, we were trying things in a hair salon that every salon said wouldn't work. But all of a sudden, it was working. And at one point, we knew we were doing pretty good she was with Paul Mitchell and stuff like that. We knew she had one of the top 10 salons in the state of Iowa. We knew we were that level. But after the fact, then we found out she was actually the top Paul Mitchell salon in the state of Iowa, and from a town of 2,400. I mean, we were drawing people from over 100 miles away. You know, but that, seeing what was happening there, learning, understanding, I was always there. You know, instead of me sitting in a semi, I would go sit and be the receptionist at a hair salon because this is what we could afford. You know, but I was always constantly watching and learning what was working there, and you know, recognizing them profit centers and stuff like that, and doing that little different that nobody else, being open when nobody else would want to be open. You know, we were very close to being open 24/7 in a hair salon in West Union, Iowa. I mean, we were at one point we were open from 5 a.m. till 10 o'clock at night, and we were getting very close to adding that last shift. But then all of a sudden, industry in West Union went away, and that demand. Good thing, you know, we were fluid enough; we could adapt it and overcome. But you know, recognizing that, you know, people, when they got off work, would rather get their hair cut or go to a tanning bed and then go home and clean up versus, I got to find a salon that would, you know, so just doing it when people wanted it done. And, you know, and that transitioned into the custom work, you know, when I started really pouring the coals on building equipment. I could learn and adapt equipment and build it so nobody else could compete with me. Well, doing custom work, I could charge what I needed to charge instead of trying to compete with my neighbors. And then about the time somebody else figured out how to do it, get out of the way, let them do it. And, you know, when we were, at one point, we were doing 300-400 acres of harvesting relay crop because nobody else could do it. You know, and the one time I pulled into a farm to cut for the guy. Well, we were going to tractor pull up there anyway, so I dropped the combine and all that off, and he calls me the next morning. Oh, by the way, I hired somebody else to do my harvest. No big deal. Went and got the combine home, went the other direction. He calls me 2 days later, and he's like, hey, that guy figured out it ain't as easy. Can I get you to come back? And I was like, yeah, but it's going to be a couple weeks, and oh, by the way, it's going to cost. You know, early adapters, I would give them a discounted rate just to get in the door and work with them. You know, as long as they supported me through the years, I would support them. But if you wanted to start playing games, I was busy enough. I didn't need to, you know, it's even like custom square baling. You know, I went from 13,000 bales a year to 0. Didn't lose a bit of sleep about it. I actually started getting sleep because, you know, I wasn't gone and running, and you know, just the willingness to adapt and overcome and keep food on the table, and it's kept the guy hungry, I guess.
So you have also been involved in many peer groups and traveled around the world and seen different parts of agriculture in different countries. What was all that about? Was that just kind of that continual learning process? Is there anything that stood out to you during that time that was like, yeah, this is so cool? Or you went overseas and you're like, I can't believe they farm this way. Like, how'd you get started with all that?
Oh, there's that. That's just that could be a day-long conversation. But I'll take you all the way back to 1994 when me and my wife got engaged. That's kind of at November 1994 is when I had my first surgery to try to correct the semi-damage and stuff like that. You know, the doctors told me, oh, geez, you know, this is going to be easy. We'll go and fix this and this. And, you know, so we sold all the milk cows at that time. And I ended up being laid up 10 weeks. And I just, you know, when me and my wife got engaged, our first commitment was the internet and cell phones. 2 pretty good decisions. You know, we knew communication was going to be key to make a strong relationship. And I ended up being laid up for 10 weeks that time. And I started a little website called Ag Online Successful Farming. I started learning that there's way more going on in the world than Fayette County, Iowa. And, as things evolved, we became pretty influential on ag talk. And then, basically my son's probably alive because of ag talk. And through that whole process, as we started realizing the social aspect and that stuff, that's when we started forming peer groups and stuff like that. And, we were at a meeting the one time and they're like, we don't want ag talk to become Facebook. It's like, well, I guess there's our sign. We better go to Facebook. So we started putting together private peer groups on ag or on Facebook, and some of them are still going today. I think then it was fast forward to 2016. I was invited to a deal in Ireland, and I didn't know I was walking into a new peer group. And I realized at that meeting the best compliment anybody can have is when you outgrow your own peer group. That's not taken away from the people in the former peer group, but it just, in that time, everybody's like, oh, you're going to shut down the old one? I was like, no, people are still learning and understanding from that one. Without a driving force, it's kind of dwindled. It's almost non-existent these days, but it was a good crutch for a lot of people. And I would say over the years now, we've probably outgrown 3 or 4 more peer groups. But every time we've got invited to that next level, you keep learning, meeting more people. And, I tell a lot of people, I can't tell you a thing that's going on in Fayette County, Iowa anymore, but I can probably tell you what's going on around the world. And it shocks people when I'm up at 3 o'clock in the morning doing a meeting in Australia or doing a meeting in Ukraine or where, I know the times and I'm willing to put that part in. One of the most impactful meetings I've ever done was 3 weeks before the Ukraine deal escalated. I was there. And, I met a lot of good farmers through that whole time frame, and I would probably say that's changed me for life. I just got asked that a couple weeks ago. We had quite a few Ukrainians over here around the Farm Progress Show time frame and that, and giving tours and helping them. I've got to the point, some of these guys have been over here 3-4 times now. I don't even, when they call, say, hey, we're bringing a group. What do my first question is, what do you guys want to see this time? This time we did bring them both to our place, but that's just because we had a few special events going on here and some of the stuff going on here. It's like, hey, if you can at least stop here. But then, north central Kansas, Nebraska is very similar to what they're dealing with there. So, some friends out there stepped in and helped them put on. I wanted to go for that part of the tour, but I was so busy doing other things. I would have just loved to be there. But, the one night we're going to a shrimp farm, and because that was one of the things they wanted to see. So through my network right now, we're working with Midland Shrimp and that. So I called him and I said, hey, I got a group wants to come out and see the shrimp. Would you host them? And, oh, by the way, I got a couple of my member farmers that want to see the shrimp, and they're looking at doing a facility. So we made a pretty good tour out of that. But, one of the guys on that trip out there, he's like, why do you give a crap so much about these guys? And I was like, just wait till you meet them. And, I've been asked that question before, and the only way I can describe it is they remind me of what I envision of the 1940 American. Coming out of World War II, they just want a chance to survive. They'll take any little bit of knowledge they can gain and make something happen. And, I enjoy watching people learn and understand, as I've said earlier. And, one of these days I'll get back over there. I mean, I was supposed to be back over there several times since, but
I think there's something going on over there right now.
Well, but even there, I trust the people that I would be working with over there. That and it's even like when we were over there right before the escalation happened. Everybody's like, "Oh my God, aren't you nervous?" And I was like, "If I go down helping somebody, what's wrong with that?" There's
my grandkids will get to tell a cool story one day.
Yeah, but it's when you've been helped as much as I have over the years, it's hard not to pay it forward. And, and that's one of the things that bothers me a lot when I see a lot of these people stumbling upon new ideals. They think it's their ideal. No, we're just grabbing old ideals, freshening them up and rehashing them. And, I'd say I'm fortunate over the years. I've had a few good ideals, but probably the ability to network and help other people learn and understand. And, I would go back to that 2015 meeting I mentioned earlier. I was kind of in a funk in that time frame. When Roland got sick that time, I kind of went through that phase. I started sharing. And I started figuring out the more I shared, the more people shared. And it's just a vicious cycle you create. At that meeting that time here with my expert farmer panel, my daughter stepped forward. That time she was 15. She's like, I'm going to kick his ass out of here. I was like, oh, fat boy better get busy. I got something to live for now. So, that's what really probably poured the coals during that time frame. It's like, okay, I got somebody paying attention here at home. I got to make room for them. Now fast forward to, both daughters have made it known they want to be involved. And someday, if we can ever get to where I want this place to be, Roland will have a place here yet too. So, we've got a young gal right now. We've had several misfires over the years. We've got a young gal right now. She says she wants to bring them back to greenhouse. She wants to do something here in the barn. It's kind of got me lit up again, trying to figure out how to make that happen. But I'll be a hard sell on it too yet, because we've been this close this many times. One of the hardest instances I'd say I've had over the years of trying to do that is we had a young Marine that we took under our wing, and I was trying to help him. And I was down in Texas, Oklahoma. I can't remember, recording something down there, and I got home and they sent me the recording. Well, when I got home here, he blew up at me, blaming me for all his problems. It was right during the Afghanistan debacle, and it just threw him for a mental loop. And I let him vent, and I let him blow off, and I said, hey, I'm going to send you something. I want you to listen to it when you're in the right mind. We parted ways. Well, about a year and a half later, I knew he had the plastic for the greenhouse and stuff like that, so I offered I was like, I think it's time. I'm just going to reach out to him and say, hey, I know things are tight for you. I need plastic for the greenhouse. I would rather buy it from you. In the meantime, I had been watching what he'd been doing. He was doing what he wanted to do here on a smaller scale, but he took his time. He did it right. And, the neat part is just reaching back out, knowing when to give him space. We still got a good working relationship. Now, the sad part is, damn, it could have been cool. But, sometimes you just can't get kicked in the teeth, and, you can't be that rabid dog that bites back. You just got to understand that not everybody's on your same plane. Give them space. But there again, it's even like my kids. I think I scared the hell out of them when I told them what my ultimate vision was here. They don't see it in the same way I do. So I'm going to try to help them in the same instance, but if I can find the right person that wants to do what that vision is, we're going to go full steam ahead here yet. And I haven't given up on that, but it's changed multiple times. And, probably the biggest thing anybody needs to know and understand about me is there's nothing set in stone. I'll tell you exactly what I'm thinking. I don't give a crap if you listen. If you listen, I'll keep telling you what I'm going to do or what I see could happen. If you listen, great, we'll move on. But I'm not going to, I don't hold anything personal. I drift to people with the like mindset over the years. But it goes back to the peer groups and that. I don't, you bump into people over time for a reason. And, I've got some good tight friends over the years out of that, and I respect them. but we don't need to hang on each other. Conversation came up here a while ago. Lucas Criswell, a good friend of mine out in Pennsylvania, we were talking about some of this. John Coots. Back when we were all learning, it goes back to Ag Talk way back in the day. We were pushing each other. We were feeding each other. We were helping each other. The biggest change I see right now is everybody has this one-upsmanship mindset. That ain't gonna last. It's gonna be the guys teaming up and figuring out how to make things click, and none of us can do this on our own. And figuring out what you're good at, pushing that button, but calling in the support when you need it. And like I said, I would say, that's one compliment I get right now is I put together networks and stuff like that. And, I 3 weeks ago, I was out in Ohio testing with a company, and I finally figured out how to describe what I actually do nowadays. Because everybody's like, well, what are you doing? And I was like, I don't know. I just, I'm drifting down the path, but I finally figured out I'm translating. That's probably the best way I describe what I'm doing right now. And, I've worked with enough engineers over the years, but I still got my farmer hat on. I eat, sleep, and breathe farming, but I know enough what the engineers want. I know what the farmer wants, so try to bring that together and translate the engineer what the farmer's saying, and the farmer what the engineer is saying. Help them understand each other. We end up with a better product in the end. And that's why I'm kind of enjoying right now stepping out of the pocket here a little bit. I know we need certain tools to go the next level. I'm a firm believer technology is probably going to get us over that edge. And everybody's, I think I alluded to that earlier. There's a lot of people condemning technology in the regen space. Well, if I can find a tool that allows me to do something that I can't do today, what's wrong with that? One of the, back to the tours and stuff like that, one of the biggest aha moments I've had in farming is I was in Australia once upon a time, and Kangaroo Island right before it burned down. And they were breaking ground yet. They could break ground, and basically what they do over there, they've got the non-wetting sand. So they would pull basically what we call a tile plow. They'd delve it, heave and boil that soil to get it to mix, and then it could take water. Well, they couldn't even raise decent kangaroo before, and just clearing the land, developing it, they could farm it regeneratively after that and pay for it in 2 years. So all the development cost, everything, and they were farming it, and there was no runoff or anything at that point. Before it rained, the water would run off and couldn't even hold plants. And Ray Archuleta happened to pick up my son and brought him home that time, and he called me that day just to give me an update what was going on. And I was like, Ray, you're not going to like what I'm going to say when I come home. He's like, what's that? And and that I always tried to relay what has happened in Iowa here. When I go other places, I try to figure out what's happening there and how to bring it home. And I said, Ray, how do we farm in nature's image when we're dealing with a bastardized product? He's like, what do you mean? I was like, well, Iowa was a swamp when the settlers first came here. They went straight on past. It wasn't until we learned how to drain the soil and make it farmable. Well, we're never going to be able to bring it back to a swamp. So how do we pick up, recognize where we're at today and to do the best we can, like they're doing there on Kangaroo Island? And I think that's probably been the biggest thing we've been able to recognize, and part of that started in 2006 when we started realizing that we need to figure out how to keep them plant cycling and, a living year round. And we got to the point at one point that we were managing basically a permanent cover crop in cash crops and stuff like that. So we had, I think it was 2015 to 2021, 22, somewhere there. We were managing cover crops in standing corn and beans. Even with the relay, our record right now is 3 cash crops in 1 year off of one, the same field. And I think that's the tip of the iceberg. I think we could probably, a friend of mine in Saskatchewan, a few of them guys up there that I was paying attention to 5, 6 years, well, 8 years ago, I guess it is now. I'm getting old. But, 2017, we were up there and paying attention. They were doing 5 and 6 crops at that point already up there. And then, they're as far as they were variable seeding the crops to the soil types and stuff like that. You harvest it all to, the biggest misnomer I would say in the world is we're too far north. Or, if you get to the southern hemisphere, they're like we're too far south. But, it just learning and adapting to do the best you can with where you're at.
Yeah, and I think I think it probably is because of many years of maybe just low profitability or that scarcity mindset from we have had many agriculture crises that have shut down a lot of people, and it makes farmers very risk adverse, which as someone who runs a business, I totally get that. You want to be risk adverse because, risk adverse means if you take on too much risk, you might lose a lot of money. That's why it's called risk. But there's also a certain element of like, hey, without that level of experimentation, what is being left on the table? Any major company anywhere in the world that is of substantial size has an R&D department for a reason. If you are a profitable business, no matter the industry you are in, you probably have some sort of research and development that your money is going into. That's pretty standard across the board. So what is still on the table in agriculture, because we let the ag businesses and the people who know stuff do the innovation for us and just expect to buy that product one day. Like we're sitting here, we're like, hey, there's however many million people work in agriculture still. How many of them are in an active research and development process of new things for this industry? Is it just the big businesses who at the end of the day do just care about selling you more things, or is there stuff going on at the farm level and the soil level that guys are actually trying to figure out? Like what's untapped there that we haven't figured out yet? I'm sure there's a lot of stuff we're still going to figure out.
Well, that's exactly. I mean, I go back to you brought up the R&D. That's in that time frame. I don't remember exactly when I bumped into Bob Recker, but seen him up in Minnesota the one time, and that's kind of when he kind of retired from Deere and started speaking and stuff like that. And he told everybody, he's like, that we were just going into a windfall era. I think that's first time corn really took off. And he was like, in 10 years, half of you farmers won't be here. And everybody's like, oh, yeah, we're going to be here. Look at, things are great. Things are doing good. And he's like, no, the half of you that spend the money on new iron and equipment are going to be easy picking. The half of you that take that windfall and invest it in your own operation and figure out how to become more efficient and better will be here. And that mindset, me and Bob went back and forth. I would think I am probably one of his longest standing cooperators. I think he might have one or two buddies down there in Waterloo, but we've worked with him a lot of years. We've rode the roller coaster. Somebody described me just a couple of weeks ago as it's like riding a dragon. Well, working with Bob's like riding a dragon too. I know what it's like to work with myself because we juke and jive, and it's hard to follow where we're going or what we're doing. And Bob is the one that consistent that go back to the wide row corn. We stumbled upon that in 2016. I had paid attention to what they were doing out in the Dakotas and Colorado and that with the wide row corn out there, but that's a totally different climate. I never thought we could make wide row corn work here until we were doing a tramline study for Deere. We had convinced, goes back to when I tell people it's expensive being my friend, because convinced one of the guys that I was working with at that time to help me figure out how to do prescription tramline treatments. We were planting through the field, and I never knew when it was shutting off the tram lines, but we had every 90 feet was our tram lines for spraying. So it'd shut off, one row, and then it'd put the population to the rows aside of it. I think there was like 10 cooperators on that project, but I was the only one with the cover crops in there. So paying attention to detail, the first thing we noticed that time was how much better the cover crops were in them rows. And okay, we seen something. How do we push that? My ideal was the two, twin row corn skip row. So 30-60, 30-60. Easy to set up on the monitor. I can punch it in, boom, we're going. In that same time frame, I had some, CRP fields, buffers and that. We planted the same, I forget exactly how it was, but, on the outside row, we went to 45,000, 40,000 on the next row, 38, and then variable rate on the rest of the planter. Well, just by doing that, we ended up using less seed, but getting more yield on that farm. Just simple little things like that, and, maximizing that edge effect already back then. And, because, we had the first electric drive corn planter in 2014, so 2014, 15 already, we were starting to do stuff like that. And with the tramline study, then, the next year, I told Bob, I said, I'm doing 30-60. Bob's like, no, you're wasting half the floor space. I was like, what do you mean wasting half the floor space? When we looked in our strips, that 60-inch gap, the cover crop was phenomenal. The cover crop next to it wasn't bad. So it's like, he's like, no, you're wasting that space. Well, you don't understand it until you see it in your field. But yeah, it ended up, we were wasting that space, beautiful cover crop on that 60, but nothing in between it. And then the next thing we learned is you've got to index the nutrients and stuff like that. And I see a lot of people when they start talking about that stuff, they start telling, oh, geez, you're going to lose 15, 20% of the yield. I would say in all the years we played with 60-inch corn, I might have lost a couple percent once or twice. But we were always paying attention to that detail. Anything we did wrong was amplified. So you had to eliminate all the variables that you could. We were planting at 2 miles an hour, just give them meters time to work and stuff like that. Through some of the mistakes we made over the years, I see a lot of people waste time and effort on irrelevant stuff. I mean, we're dealing with plants. You can't outsmart, it goes back to you can't outsmart Mother Nature. I see guys, oh, geez, you got to plant this, you got to plant that. No, we've pushed it hard enough, nature will adapt. We've had over 300 some bushel an acre and 60-inch corn. It can be done. It's a fine line, though, between success and failure. I mean, with that said, that when I figured out, I offered free grazing for several years and I could never get anybody. Everybody's like, well, why aren't you doing the 60-inch corn? Well, the perfect opportunity is a guy grazing. We didn't have anything left to prove. So it's like, yeah, I'd like helping people out, but I'm busy enough anymore. I'm going to go focus on what I can do. And one of the things I'm trying to figure out, and that's kind of why the pause in the relay cropping, even it's not just health, it's trying to figure out, fertility and that. How do we fit that into that time frame? We've brought manure back on every acre. Well, if we've got a living root out there all the time, we've got a cash crop out there all the time. I'm of the mindset that driving over a cash crop is never going to help it. So we're not going to drive over a cash crop to spread fertility unless we can figure out how to index it. That's been one of the hurdles in that. And with that said, that was part of the easy decision this year. We were going for about every 4 or 5 years, getting manure on every acre, to now we're down to about every 2 years. We're getting some manure on every acre. And I would say our I'm afraid to admit how good the crop looks this year because Mother Nature will humble me, but I'll tell anybody, my neighbor's got the best looking crop I've ever seen around here, and I think we can hold our own against it.
So what do you think over all your years of farming and experimenting has been the number one thing that's helped you?
I got a wife that still tolerates me. I got a grandkid that thinks it's pretty dang cool to go down in the creek and see the fishies and stuff like that. And, like I said, it just, the internal support has been critical. And, not that I ever need somebody patting my back, but just, go back to 2015 when my dad, I knew my dad respected what I was doing, but to hear him actually come out and say it, that was one of those boosts. And then, I said, the girls, do they want to be directly involved in what we're doing here on the farm? Not to the scale that I would like it, but, it's just, if people think what I've done is crazy, they don't want to see what's went on in my head, I guess I'll put it that way. I mean, the envelope's pretty big where I want to get to, and like I said, that might be coming yet, but it'll be a slow, steady pace, and I'm not going to force anybody to do it. It's just getting the right pieces of the puzzle, and I think people got a taste of that a couple weeks ago with the potential to come, I guess. And, the young gal that wants to come is a trained chef. If we could support her, and we had a menu at a field day that I think blew people's minds away. And, part of the organizations I'm with right now, they always want world-class events. Well, that's where I want to keep pushing. And so I like the beer and that, there's a good story behind all that. And, when you get your name on a beer label and, the story behind it, all that starts cementing what we're doing. And, the other night there, if you know and understand our story, the menu was trout, bison brisket, and a very corn-forward menu. So corn in 8 different versions, including beer and whiskey and tortillas and tacos, all with our corn in it. It's them subtle little things that are going to keep pushing me, and see what happens for the future.
Nice. Well, we could definitely talk all day. I think we'll have to sit down and do another episode because, I feel like we've only covered 25% of all the things you've got going on in your head. I mean, there's so many things from technology to the beer to your network to all your travels and all those things. And there's so much more we could dig into. But we will sit here and talk for 4 hours, and we both have places we're gonna have to be.
It's been a hell of a ride.
So we'll have to stop this today. But yeah, guys, if you want to check out any of Loran's stuff. I think you're on Twitter and LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Twitter and LinkedIn are where he's at. I'm sure you'll hear him humming around at different conferences and things like that. So, yeah.
You got to look for me anymore. I tend to hide in the shadows. So
I think you stand out in a crowd. So I think you'll figure it out.
Well, we have started wearing long pants these days a little bit more. So
that's okay. I mean, you see guys wearing shorts. I mean, there's people I know in the farm world that if they wear shorts, they'll just be outcast where they live. So
if that used to be our signature, we'd wear shorts no matter where we were and that. But as I get older now, and this trying to get healthier in life is kind of costing me. My kids make fun of me because I'll wear sweatpants and stuff like that. And and part of that's with the knee surgeries and that. I learned I got to keep the knee joints warmer and that. And I'm not looking forward to winter. And last winter already, I started realizing the sweatshirt and long pants ain't all bad. But it's the new incognito. I can go hide and be behind. Like I said, I'm kind of enjoying being behind the scenes and helping the guys that want to be out there. And I respect anybody that wants to step out, but I also respect the ones that appreciate where they come from. And and it goes back to what I said earlier. The hardest thing is when some of these guys think they've invented a lot, and we're just rehashing 99% of the new ideals. What did I see for the patent? I do a lot of patent searches and that stuff anymore, and the truly original patentable ideals is pretty minimal.
Yeah, I was gonna say, there's nothing new under the sun, and the patent office is a wonderful resource because you realize the hundreds of thousands of things that people have definitely already invented before you. They just and that's where the art comes in. It's like who has made it to market and made it available to people and actually usable.
Yeah,
that's you tinker, you make things. It's like it's easy to make one thing. It's easy to make 5 things. It's not easy to make 5,000 of those things over and over and over and over again. And it can be done, but you typically need to be someone like Deere who's like, yeah, we can spin up manufacturing this new technology. But once again, we'll get rambling.
Well, but that's one of those chapters we could really dive into, that's where I'm at today. Yeah. I realized last January when I was at the No-Till conference, I've changed. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. And, I used to enjoy getting on stage and all that and talking to people, but my mindset this day and age, working with the number of startups that I work with and that these days, it has got to be very focused to help these companies overcome them hurdles. And, they get distracted too easy. And, it's like dealing with teenagers at times. And I never was a school teacher.
Startups are the teenagers of the business world.
Well, but it's fun. And, watching these companies thrive and succeed. And, we've got some pretty good companies that we're working with right now, and just taking that time and helping them. And at the same breath, I know what they're working on is what's going to help take agriculture to the next level. Can I, and that mindset really opened the doors this spring when the shop blew up. I walked out of the house the one morning and, look across and see the shop's not there. And I was like, well, I used to go out to the shop and help build stuff. Now we go help build companies. And, helping them learn from our mistakes is that I would say that's what's driving a guy right now. And, keep an eye on the ball, though, that, with the robotics and some of that stuff in the background, that's how we're going to take this cropping system to the next level. One of the things I keep impressing upon people is, what's the new Deere 9R 830 XT, whatever. I don't even pay attention to that stuff anymore. But, what's that thing weigh? I think somebody said 80,000 pounds. Well, if we're not creating compaction, how much time and effort do we have to waste mitigating it if we didn't create it in the first place? When you can start replacing that horsepower and weight with something a fraction of the size and not doing that physical damage to the soil, that's where I see our next unbridled potential is going to be, and trying to figure out how to help maximize that. That's what's driving me right now. So
we'll figure it out. So, all right, I'm cutting us off. We'll keep going. So, thanks for joining, Loran.
Yep.